Hello everyone. Today we're going to discuss about the balance of payment crisis in India in 1991. We'll see why the balance of payment crisis of 1991 happened and how the balance of payment crisis in India 1991 was resolved. So let's see what happens first of all in a scenario when the government increases its fiscal deficit. So let's assume the government increases its fiscal deficit, which is nothing but the excess of spending over revenue. That is, it takes in more debt. So also let's assume this debt is monetized by the central bank of the country, and hence the money supply in the economy also goes up. That would mean that the demand in the economy goes up. Increase in demand in the economy, there can be two responses of the supply in the economy. In one scenario, the supply of the economy remains flat, which can happen if the resources, if there is no slack in the resources of the economy, in which case this would lead to inflation. In the second scenario, the supply in the economy responds and it increases. That would mean that there would not be really any much inflation in the economy, and instead there would be growth in the economy. So let's take the first scenario and go ahead with it. Let's continue. So in this scenario, because the domestic supply didn't respond to the increase in demand as a result of the increase in government's fiscal deficit, the imports in the economy increase. And since the imports in the economy increase, that would mean that the exchange rate of the country would come down, leading to increase further increase in inflation. Now this increase in inflation would ensure that in a normal scenario that the demand would fall. So think about it. The increase in demand, which was not catered by the increase in supply, meant that the inflation in the economy increased. And that very inflation increase ultimately culled that excess demand. And hence the inflation then comes down. This is what happens in a normal scenario when the government increases fiscal deficit and the domestic supply cannot cater to the increase in demand. Now let's see when the supply doesn't cater to the increase in demand and the exchange rate policy of the government is fixed. That is a fixed exchange rate. So in this scenario, as the demand increases and the supply cannot match the increase in demand, as we saw in the previous slide, this would lead to a rise in imports. A rise in imports this time would have led to a decline in the exchange rate, which would have ultimately led to a decline in imports. However, in this scenario, the exchange rate are kept fixed. That means the imports will not decline and would rise further in the wake of the increasing demand. And that would mean a buildup in the foreign debt of the economy, thereby ultimately leading to a bigger fall in the exchange rate, a devaluation of the currency, which would then lead to further price rises, shortages of raw material in the economy, increase in interest rates, the domestic interest rates, and both of which would impact the supply and lead to a big supply shock. Unfortunately, that bigger supply shock in the wake of a stable or a persistent demand can lead to a galloping inflation or even a hyperinflationary collapse in the economy in the worst case. So with this background, let's see what happened in India. In India, pre 1991, we were following a license Raj policy, where quotas are fixed on the supply side of the economy. So without a government license, no new production can be done, no new industries could be set up, and even if within your own facility or own industry that has been already set up, you cannot increase the production without getting a permission or a license from government. So actually supply in the economy never really responded to the forces of demand in the economy. And so the ever increasing demand of the country, which was but natural due to the increasing population, even that basic demand could not be catered to the supply, leading to so much shortages in the economy. Exchange rate in India was fixed, and hence the Indian rupee was quite expensive when compared to its true market value. Also, post 1984, the, the imports in India, the imports regime in India was liberalized. Per se, it would have been a great move had it been one of the steps in the entire gamut of liberalization that the country wanted. So, what happened because of that? That opened the window for fulfilling the pent-up demand in the economy that was unable to be fulfilled by the domestic supply due to the government regulations. Also, the fixed exchange rate meant, as we have discussed in the previous slide, meant that the rupee was expensive and hence the imports were cheaper and much more lucrative. Also, the supply constraint ensured that there were lack of exports from India. And in any case, the products were expensive because of the exchange rate and also of low quality versus the global standards due to the domestic industrial protection. Thus, our current account deficit bulged. This put pressure on the exchange rate, which was fixed, and hence the precious little forex reserves were spent even on maintaining the fixed exchange rate. So the current account deficit put a pressure on the exchange rate. Maintaining that artificial exchange rate put a pressure on the exchange on our forex reserves, and the lower domestic productivity. To get an indication how exchange rate and inflation behave together, kindly check the link given in the description of this presentation. So then it meant India had to take more and more foreign debt to keep up its exchange forex reserves, which increased the pressure further on the economy. And later on, when the condition worsened, more foreign debt was hard to come by. And the drain on the forex reserves increased, and add to that the pressure of debt repayments meant that India had that balance of payment crisis. So let's look at it in the scenario what happened in the case of India. Now, since the exchange rate was fixed, that led to a drain on the forex reserves and hence the balance of payment crisis, as we saw in the previous slide, which then ultimately led to the devaluation of the currency and the exchange rate. However, in case of India, what happened? Since our supply side was constrained artificially because of some stupid government regulations and policies, the license system was removed, that policy was changed, and so our supply increased. And instead of going through that entire pain of hyperinflationary or galloping inflationary collapse, what happened was our growth increased and was able to meet the demand in the economy, and also the inflation started coming down, which meant with inflation coming down, domestic demand increased further and was then easily met with the increase in supply, as the country had so much of idle resources and slack which could then be utilized because of once this licensing Raj policy was done away with. And that led to higher growth in the Indian economy. So in conclusion, the balance of payment crisis of 1991 in India emanated from the government regulations of licensing that was due to the socialist mindset prevalent with thought of profit as a sin that ensured shortages in the economy. The build-up had been on for more than a decade, but the trigger for that was the import regime liberalization post 1984. The problem was tackled once our government was forced to junk away or liberalize this licensing regime. It was a low-hanging fruit for India, and it was lucky in that regards. However, many countries may not be that lucky, and they have to end up going through that huge economic pain to get that we saw in the previous slides to get this issue resolved. So thank you very much for watching this presentation. In case you are interested in such content, do subscribe to the channel and comment in case of any questions. Thank you.